If the technology stops working, you're just going to have to come. All right, so your class, I've turned the stream back on. Your classmates have now commented, yeah, maybe show up. Someone told me it's back. Hello. Okay, yeah, the stream died. Someone told me, all right, we're back, hopefully. Come to class. There's no technology failures in class. Okay, someone told me, I swear. Someone type in, the stream is back. Hello. Okay, you don't understand why poly and extended are horizontal. Poly, is it going to be on the final? Yes, there's definitely going to be questions about this on the final. Okay, I will very quickly explain, right? Because basically you're adding more families in like, that are, let's say, the same generational cohort, right? So you have adult, parent, adult, parent, adult, parent, adult, parent. And on the extended family, you've got different generations, right? Old, middle-aged, young, baby, right? So you're adding it because it's different age stratification in vertical, so the extended family. With polygamy, polyandry, you're adding more people of the same generation. So it's a horizontal expansion. Okay, there, thank you. Person in class. Hopefully that helps. All right. Okay, what was I saying? All right. Oh, I love this slide. It's a lot of text on white, and I love it. So, conflict theory, and feminist theories. Okay, so if we go right back to the very beginning of conflict theory, specifically Friedrich Engels. So Engels was a collaborator of Karl Marx. So if you ever pick up a copy of the Communist Manifesto, right, Karl Marx's treatise on the emergence of a communist society, it is co-written by Friedrich Engels, who was a committed Marxist, a committed socialist, and, you know, he gets his name put along with Karl Marx, not because he's any great shakes intellectually, but because his daddy had money, and he bankrolled, I'm going to say bad things about Friedrich Engels, he bankrolled Karl Marx. Like, most of Karl Marx's career is financed by Friedrich Engels. And Engels, you know, his dad was a rich merchant and a factory owner, and apparently Friedrich had daddy issues and hated dad, so he funded a communist workers' movement, and, you know, our good friend Karl Marx. So, all of this kind of radical thinking about families in kind of Marxist thought and coming from Engels basically said that the nuclear family, and that traditional nuclear families, especially the ones where, you know, the idea is the man goes to work, you know, he goes to work, and the woman stays home, and she raises the kids, right? Oops, that's a woman. And, you know, is related with kids. That ultimately comes from the emergence of wealth inequalities that come with the Industrial Revolution. So, and it becomes about, specifically, controlling women sexually and economically to ensure that men could be able to pass property on to their male offspring, right? That basically women's rights are stripped away under capitalism because men want to control women sexually, right? They want to make sure that they have their wife that doesn't go anywhere, that doesn't leave them, and that they own all of the property so that they can pass them on to their primarily male offspring. Okay, so Engels' solution, and Karl Marx, you know, broadly, you know, part of the Marxist tradition generally is a disdain for the nuclear family in general. And we see this, right, all across the kind of communist spectrum. You know, we saw this in Lenin specifically, right? In a lot of Lenin's work, and the kind of communists in the Soviet Union, breaking up the nuclear family was seen as of paramount importance. I think it's, anyway, it doesn't matter. I was going to say, I think it was Julia Kristeva. She's, again, kind of a contemporary of Foucault's and a Marxist. You know, one of the things that was, I think it's Kristeva, I can't remember if it's Kristeva or Butler, but they advocated the idea that women should not be given the choice to stay at home and raise children, because if they are, too many women will choose that, and that gets in the way of the revolution. So baked into conflict theory, and especially the feminist theories that are attached to conflict theory, so think here second wave feminism in particular, is a very anti-family kind of orientation, one that ultimately views family as a political problem and something that maintains the status quo, right? It maintains the capitalist system in lots of ways. Okay, so yeah, we see this, and we see this, still down the line, kind of contemporary Marxists, a lot of them remain very kind of anti-family. They really, especially marriage and the kind of nuclear family, they want to see broken apart. Okay, so, but, why some people object to this particular Marxist framing. Gender inequality exists, obviously, in non-capitalist societies, right? You don't have to know too much history to say, go back to Rome, right? In the Roman Empire, women had no rights, right? Women were chattel property, just as they were until very recently in the history of capitalist societies, right? Women were property, women had no political rights, they couldn't own anything, they couldn't inherit their husband's estates, and we can look at traditional societies all over the world and we see precisely the same things. And yeah, patriarchy seems deeply rooted in certain aspects of the human condition, things like, the military, especially labor-based economies. If you have to work really hard and things take a lot of physical labor, if that's the kind of economy you live in, so basically every single economy in human history prior to about 1960, men tend to do most of that work because men are physically stronger on the whole. So if you're laboring in fields or you're carrying heavy things, men tend to do that. Obviously, in military circumstances, the same thing pervades. That trickles down then into the kind of the cultural history of mankind, which mostly privileges men. So it's not just capitalism, right? We've seen this mostly through human history on the whole. And yeah, for feminists, especially critical feminists or conflict feminists, one of the things that they tend to advocate for is a genuine gender revolution to alter the state of affairs. And this is one of the things that critics of Marxist theories tend to derisively call, a revolution of human nature. That we need to fundamentally sort of alter human nature to change, the way things have been. I don't want to over-talk the Soviet Union, but very famously, one of the things that the Soviets wanted to do, and part of it was a gender revolution, was to get away from, let's say, from Homo sapien, right? So they wanted to do away with Homo sapiens. So the USSR wanted to do away with Homo sapiens and create what they called, I love this one, Homo Sovieticus. The new Soviet man, right, who wouldn't be bound by things like class and gender and all of these sorts of things. Now, and here, again, I'm not a Marxist, so I don't have a problem sort of, being a little bit derisive towards Marxists. I think it's safe to say that the project of Homo Sovieticus, the new Soviet man, failed spectacularly. This revolution in human nature that was predicated, that basically the Soviets said had to happen for us to reach socialism and communism, never actually happened, right? And we never broke down, family ties and gender completely, or even things like human greed and the desire to acquire more than your neighbor. Wow, I made a mess of this slide. I'm really sorry. Okay, so gender divisions of labor. Again, in conflict theory and the feminist theories that are attached to conflict theory, one of the big areas that they suggest keeps women in particular in subservient roles is the gender division of labor, particularly in the home. So, for instance, if we go back to the 1960s, right? In the 1960s, large numbers of women started to go back into the workforce, right? Once their children were off in school, lots of women basically resumed the careers that they probably had before they got married and before they had children. And so they went back into the workforce. But one of the things that feminists observed was that there remained a gender division of labor. And so often what they said was that women who were going back to work, and this was true in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I think it's still true to some extent today, were required to work, sometimes they called it a double day. The double day or the second shift. I don't know why I can't write on the bottom of my screen. I'll write it up here. Second shift. Probably my pen is garbage. Okay, so basically women would do a shift at work, and then they had to come home and do a shift. They would care for the children, right? They would put them to bed, they would give them their baths, right? They would do the laundry, they would cook the meals, they would clean up the meals. And, men were like this guy, right? Sitting on the couch, being like, honey, if you could make me a sandwich and bring me a beer, that would be great. The old kind of stereotype of the sort of lazy husband, right? Not saying anyone is like that anymore or at all or ever was, but that was the kind of critique that feminists had. So they call this the gender division of labor, right? That basically women are roughly responsible for twice as much as men because they're in charge of the domestic sphere as well. I was going to say if someone could tell my wife that would be great. No, I'm kidding. She's a terrible cook and I never want her to cook. So I'm a much better cook than she is. Frankly, when she makes meals, it's a horror beyond words. She sometimes asks, what do you say about me in class? And I'm like, only good things. Except about her cooking. It's terrible. Oh, jarred past the sauces and the like. Okay, so now I've lost my thought. Okay, so basically one of the things that conflict theorists will say shrinks the gender gap in domestic chores, right? And this is the goal, right? We need to rebalance from a feminist and conflict theory perspective, the roles so that women don't have that kind of second shift or double day. Okay, so the smaller the earnings gap between the wife and her husband, the more equal the division of labor. So one of the ways to thin out the gender gap is to have women make more money, because if they make more money, right, they're, from this perspective, it's like they have more economic power to argue that the labor should be more evenly split. So the argument being, especially in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and in some cases in the 90s, men were making a lot more money than women, much more likely to work full-time. Women were much more likely to work part-time. So if you're working part-time, right, the full-time working partner or the one making more money is like, well, I make more of the money, so you should be in charge of more of the work at home. And conflict theorists will say the best way to thin that out is basically to have women make more money. And that's, increasingly women are economically outperforming men in a lot of fields. So that has started to happen. Okay, and attitude, right? If we can change people's attitudes, that there should be more equity in household division of labor, there is more equality. And we see this particularly on a class basis. Middle class and upper class people tend to have more egalitarian views of men and women than, say, working class and poor people. And so you see patterns where in the working class, the division of labor remains much more traditional, and in the upper and middle classes, it is much more evenly distributed. Okay. I'm not restarting it again. I'm sorry. Mine looks like it's working, so I can't. If it's down again, I can't fix it again. I'm sorry. I'm not wasting more class time. Anyway, we'll figure it out. I did the same lecture last year. I can send it to them. They can email me about it. Okay, so, all right, mate selection. So how do we pick our sexual and romantic partners? Hopefully not on Tinder. That's a bad way. No, I'm kidding. Maybe it is. I have no idea. I've never been on Tinder. All right, and God willing, I never will. Just want to die before my wife. That's all I want. Okay, it might be from her cooking. Who knows? See? That's what we call a callback. There we go. I got you with the crack about my wife's cooking. Okay. So, in most of 2 minutes, you're asleep and sleepy, and then I made a joke about my wife's cooking, and we're back. Okay. Have I mentioned it's bad? Okay, just checking. Oh, no one can overcook a steak like she can. I'll just put it that way. All right, in most societies in human history, right, love has very little to do with marriage, right? If we look at, historically, why did people get married? You had things like dowries and bride prices. It was often for economic and political reasons. You were given to, you were basically, an arranged marriage was set up for you so that you would be supported, someone would take care of you, and your family would either pay that person, right, in terms of a dowry. So it's like, all right, with Sheila, you get 3 goats and 1 basket of apples per year until she dies, right? Sorry, that's terrible. But that was the world, right? It was, we pay you to take our daughter, or, in societies where women were scarce for whatever reason, someone might pay to marry your daughter. Or, in some cases, you would be married off to someone for political reasons because your parents wanted to align the 2 families together, right? Think medieval Italy, and it's like, if your family marries our daughter, we'll be linked together by blood, and then, our resources will be combined, and all of those sorts of things, right? So historically, marriage was, really not about love. It gains this kind of currency sometime in like the 19th century, where people start to become more individualistic for one, and change the way they think about marriage, and it becomes all about love, right? Now again, it's not that nobody ever got married for love. Otherwise, back in the 17th century, Romeo and Juliet would not have worked, and it did. But the predominant way that people got married, and I mean, you see it in that play. I don't know, now I'm referencing Shakespeare in a sociology class. Everything could break down, and the universe might implode. But in that play, right, Romeo and Juliet are in love, but it doesn't matter because Juliet's been promised to Paris, right? And she's supposed to marry Paris instead of Romeo. And they get married, and it's a big, well, it would be a big scandal if anyone knew about it before they self-slaughter. But yeah, in the past it wasn't that way, and it's only really with the coming of modernity that we get a shift to thinking about marriage as being principally based on love, right? Mostly it was you get married and then you hope you fall in love with the person that you married or come to love them. It was a very different way of thinking. Okay, I say okay too much. I'm sorry. Even today, social forces largely determine who you potentially will partner with. Now, I will say this has been the case for a long time, but one thing that's starting to really change this a little bit, stupid pen, online dating is kind of scrambling our understanding of the mating market in major ways. Now, that's a story for a different day, but typically speaking, you would have tended historically to marry people who are very similar to you. So the really important ones are race, religion, and socioeconomic class. Because traditionally, people have kind of clustered together along those lines, right? You would tend to have gone to school in a particular neighborhood, and that neighborhood would have had pretty stable patterns of things like socioeconomic class, right? You all would have been middle class or working class or poor, and so whoever you're going to meet and marry would have been working class, middle class, or poor, depending on where you were. People also tended to cluster together in terms of kind of racial background and in terms of religion, right? People tended to be similarly kind of located religiously. So people historically have tended to marry people like themselves. And on average, right, for the average individual in the past, your total number of people that you could potentially, through kind of social connections, meet and marry was somewhere between 100 and 200 people, right? That's how many kind of potential partners you would have had in the past. Now, the reason I say online dating is really scrambling our understanding of this is because, online dating does not respect geography in large proportion, and people are much more mobile than they used to be. It doesn't respect race or socioeconomic class or any of those things. And it's done, sort of taken this relatively small number of potential mates and exploded it upwards, right? In kind of on average, your dating pool in a large city, is somewhere now between 10,000 and maybe at the outside about 100,000 people. At the outside. So much more kind of choice. So it's really scrambling our understanding of how we mate and marry, right? Online dating is messing everything up. It's not just that you're getting unwanted pictures of other people's genitals, which definitely I'm sure happens, I've heard. You know, my female friends who have gotten divorced and gone back on online dating certainly suggest that it is a hive of scum and villainy, and not much else. And, you know, anyway, I will give the social commentary. Let's just say their conclusion is all the good ones are probably married. And that their advice is, if you have a good one, hang on to them. Dear God, it's a cesspit out there. But it's scrambling our understanding of mating markets because it's expanded them greatly. Okay, I don't know, 10 minutes, 11 minutes, I still have lots of time. Okay, so today we have two kind of broad categories of long-term partnering, marriage and cohabitation, right? And basically they're very similar in lots of ways, although there are some very clear distinctions between them that still make them important. Okay, so typically, right, they both include this. They both include sexual relations and common residence, right? So typically married people live together and they have sex. Nothing too shocking about that. And typically people who are living together, you know, cohabiting, not roommates, although it might happen, you know, are living together and are having sex, right? So if you're living with your boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, whatever you want, what term you want to use, typically those two things are true. Now, marriage obviously is a little bit different, and I always get this comment, why do we need some piece of paper or some ceremony to tell us, you know, how to live or that we're together? You don't, but this is just typically how it's been, right? Marriages typically start with some kind of legal ritual and legal authority, right? So the state gives you a marriage license, and you're either married by a justice of the peace or a religious authority of some kind. That's what marriage looks like. Cohabitation typically starts without fanfare, and, you know, on average, apparently, from the literature, the conversation is like this: my lease is running out. Okay, so do you think we should move in together? Well, I guess we could save on bills. Cool. And that's how cohabitation starts, right? With very little fanfare. And, you know, then it's like, well, I'll clear out a couple of drawers for you so you have somewhere to put your socks. And there you go. You're cohabiting now. You did it. And it didn't cost you like $20,000 for a wedding ceremony. I think much of the decline in marriage, by the way, is down to what I call the marriage industrial complex, and dresses that cost more than a car. But there you go. Okay, so marriages typically are kind of culturally accepted, and they come with cultural scripts, right? What does it mean to be a husband? What does it mean to be a wife? You know, how do people act with each other? What does that mean? All that sort of stuff. Do you take their name? Do you not take their name? Cohabiting couples tend to create their own scripts, right? Because there's no norm when it comes to cohabiting. Everyone's a little bit different. And so you create your own script and own divisions of labor within the house. And very importantly, you know, one of the things with marriage is it remains much more enforceable, penalties for ending the marriage, and a legal process you go through for dissolution. And while there have been efforts to create a legal pathway over here, it still remains kind of a black hole. If you break up you know, with your cohabiting partner, how do you divide property? If it's like my friend, he went to work one day and he came back and everything was gone. She just was like, I'm leaving him, I'm done. And she just had her friend show up with a moving truck and they took everything. He came back to a completely empty apartment. And then I got the phone call. I was like, hey, can I stay with you for a couple of days? It's like, why? Why don't you stay at your place? He's like, well, I don't want to sleep on the floor. Like, what happened, Ryan? She's left. She honestly took everything. Even the plates that we gave them when they moved in together as a housewarming gift. She took everything. It's kind of funny, actually. I laughed at him. Okay. Yeah, rates of cohabiting, you know, have skyrocketed, you know, in the last few decades. If we go back to 1981, it was only about 5.7% of couples living together were cohabiting. By 2016, it was, you know, over a quarter, and that rate has continued to rise over the subsequent 8 years, right? And it's probably going to reach, you know, a certain critical point once millennials and Gen Z are the dominant generations left. that it's going to be basically of people living in coupled relationships across 50% once millennials and Gen Z are the dominant generations in our cohorts, right? Basically, it's the baby boomers and Gen X that are sort of holding that number together, after which it's going to completely flip. Quebec has led the way, so there's basically huge regional variations. Quebec has led the way. Cohabitation happened in much larger rates in Quebec, and it remains much higher in Quebec than it is anywhere else in the rest of Canada. But increasingly, it's just part of the normal social script for young people, right? It is, you wouldn't do what other generations, say like the silent generation did, which is like you meet someone, you start dating, you get engaged, you get married, and then you move in together. Today, right, for most of our kind of emerging adult cohort in that 20 to 29 kind of age group, you meet someone, you move in together to test out the relationship. On average, it lasts about 3 years. And some people then transition either and break up, or they transition to marriage, right? But most of them break up. So sometimes it's used as a kind of intermediate step on the path to marriage, usually like testing out the relationship. Some view it as an alternative to living alone or a way to save costs. Hey, with the rent so high and the mortgage is so high these days, can't blame anyone for wanting to save costs. And increasingly, it's also starting to be seen as a total alternative to marriage, as a replacement for it. And especially in generations that are less institutionalized and specifically less religious, and this is Gen Z and millennials, increasingly they don't see the purpose of an institutionalized marriage, right? Because it's just, what's the difference between the two? If you don't believe there's anything sacred about it, you don't worry about it. Okay, so this has obviously led to a bunch of new vocabulary for, started with millennials especially, but really Gen Z has carried on and created its own new vocabulary, which is ever shifting. But things like, friends with benefits. So this is, someone that you, obviously, you know what all these are. I don't have to tell you, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because it's part of the course. Friends with benefits, right? You might call it multiple recurring hookups. That's how I refer to it. Multiple recurring hookups, right? Where basically you have sex with someone who you're friends with, but it's supposed to come with zero emotional attachment. It's just a way, it's seen as a particularly efficient, this is the language that's used by young people, by the way, I'm not saying this, efficient, like a vacuum, way of fitting sex into your life, especially in those emerging adult years where you're in college and you're trying to get your first job and you're trying to get set. Hookups, right? Spontaneous one-time sexual encounters between strangers or acquaintances. And, in the kind of typical millennial definition, a hookup could be anything from kissing all the way to sex. Didn't have to be having sex with someone. Some kind of sexual encounter that could have been, kissing and groping, or actually sleeping with the person. It's a pretty broad range. And then, this one, I don't know if it's used as much as it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. Living apart together, where people spend time at each other's apartments or in each other's residences, and they live apart, but they're also together in some ways. Not quite done. I know, usually I'm done way early, but not today. Oh, okay. Now I'm done. Because there's more on here that I want to talk about than I can do in 3 minutes. So let's leave it here. And crazy. Okay, you're gonna tell my wife. That's fine. She knows she's a bad cook. All right, we'll see you all next time.